Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, it is our pleasure that from today onwards we are going to start a very new series, and this series is on the Mauryas. We would be discussing on Mauryas. As I said, this is the first lecture in the series. In future sessions also we would be covering and we would be talking more on Mauryas. And for this, dear friends, today we have again with us in our studios Dr. Shankar Kumar. Dr. Shankar Kumar is Assistant Professor in Hindu College, Department of History, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and the way he used to deliver his lecture with the help of this EduSet platform. I believe that these lectures are very much beneficial for you. So for benefit of yours, let's introduce our guest, Dr. Shankar Kumar. Dr. Kumar, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. And good afternoon, viewers. As stated, today we shall be discussing the Mauryan period, and there are several facets to this period that we are talking of. Broadly, what we mean by Mauryan period is the period from say around 321 to 185 BC, before the start of the Common Era, and that would mean that we are talking of a time bracket of around 150 years. Yet, these 150 years, when telescoped into the entire historical period that we think of in Indian history, appears not very big, not very vast, yet they are very significant period on account of several factors. All of us know that Mauryans meant the first empire builders in ancient India, or for that matter in Indian history. Mauryans also meant that for the first time, you can say peasant society had come into existence in a very significant way, penetrating into greater part of what we today understand as the Gangetic plains, upper, middle and lower included. And not only that, but its penetration down south across Vindhyas. So, the kind of colonization by the peasant society that we are so used to is something which was happening probably for the first time during the same period, which is the Mauryan period. Now, I am not saying that the entire dynamics of social and economic changes have something to do with the kind of political push, but in the case of Mauryas, we will see that quite a few things, quite a few policies, quite a few phenomena which were associated with the state policies were very instrumental in bringing about this transformation, which was a very critical transformation so far as Indian history is concerned. Also, since as stated by Geetika, this is going to be a series of what I believe at least a couple of lectures on Mauryas. So, what we shall be doing today is to have some kind of a broad overview of the Mauryas with respect to its significance to Indian history. And in the subsequent part of the lecture, which would follow, we shall be talking about the nature of the empire and how centralized was it, or the kind of historiography which is weaved around Mauryan period in the nationalist phase, in the post-nationalist phase. We have more and more focus on decentralized elements of the Mauryan empire and several other issues. But today, we shall primarily be talking about the sources of the reconstruction of the Mauryan period, which again becomes phenomenal so far as the preceding period is concerned, because by the time we reach 320 BC or around this time, we find that with the emergence of the Mauryas as a big, huge state with the capacity to build empire, we have quite a few durable sources or durable materials on which quite a few historical documents or quite a few historical instances were recorded. And that means that a historian has a wide pool of sources and resources to reconstruct the period of Mauryan history. Of course, we shall be getting into the details of this in order to understand the real import of what we are just discussing. So, apart from sources, we would also try to understand the actual significance of the Mauryan period with respect to the historical changes. And these historical changes were not triggered only around this time, but it would be very apt to understand that Mauryan empire or emergence of the Mauryan rule, we can say, should legitimately be traced to very critical transformational changes that had happened around 6th century BC in North India. And this 6th century BC time bracket is again widely regarded as the axial period of Indian history and ancient Indian history in particular, because quite a few very we can say significant and durable changes had happened around this time, which continued to inform the subsequent history in a very big way, and we can say that even today quite a few cities which made its appearance in Indian history for the first time around 6th century BC are the main cities of India even in 21st century in the times that we live in. So, and they by and large have a very continuous history. You can think of several cities, be it Patliputra, the modern Patna today, or Kashi, the modern Varanasi today, and so forth. So, apart from that, we have quite a few other very critical transformations that had happened. For instance, trade and commerce had for the first time come in a big way around 6th century BC, and in the Mauryan period we find almost the same process reaching greater heights. Similarly, we have apart from towns, trade and commerce, we also have the coins, metallic coins coming for the first time in 6th century BC in North India, and they continued even in the Mauryan period. In fact, it was only in the post-Mauryan period that we find some kind of again a big kind of a change in the way coins were issued and also minted and made, and the political trappings behind this. But up to the Mauryas, it was the same trajectory of change which was triggered around 6th century BC that continued. We shall see as to how all these things unfolded during the Mauryan times. Similarly, we have the unorthodox religions like Jainism, Buddhism, and several other sects which had come up in a big way around 6th century BC. In the Mauryan period, they continued to be a major force of change, and so much so that several royal policies pursued by different kings in the Mauryan period in fact revolved around these issues pertaining to unorthodox or heterodox sects, or which by this time had assumed the form of full-fledged religion. Also, the architecture which is built around these themes, religious themes and also non-religious themes, had a fair degree of connection with the Buddhism as a religion or Jainism as a religion, and also the external contacts that they had with the Persian area and also the Greek area. So, these are some of the things which we shall try to understand and discuss in today's lecture in order to understand the significance of the Mauryan period so far as Indian history and tradition are concerned. Now, as we stated, it is 321 BC to around say 185 BC of time period that we are talking of. We all do know that Mauryans involved several kings. Most noticeable among them were the first three, that is Chandragupta Maurya, Bindusar and Ashok. And subsequent to him, we have a series of kings continuing up to 185 BC, but they are not as iconic as the first three, and it is generally believed that it was in the period post the Ashokan period that the decline of Mauryan Empire had set in. Historians attribute different reasons for the decline of Mauryan Empire, but that is something that we shall be discussing tomorrow, but that is in the next series of the discussion around Mauryas. Today, we shall be trying to limit our discussion to sources and significance, and also, of course, the origin. And we shall see that of the several kings that we mentioned, there are quite a few policies pursued particularly by Chandragupta Maurya and subsequently by Ashok, which we know very well, and we know about these policies and the details of these periods primarily because we have by and large a non-religious kind of texts. Of course, historians today do argue that even the Kautilya's Arthashastra cannot be regarded as a non-Brahmanical kind of a source. Nevertheless, what we mean here is that the major preoccupation of Kautilya's Arthashastra as a source material for the reconstruction of Mauryan period is policy, is administration, is taxation, is political economy, and certainly not as used to be the case in the earlier corpus of literature that ancient India bequeaths to us. For instance, it is certainly not like Dharma Sutras, it is certainly not like the Vedic sources, whose major preoccupation is not to record the mundane details of everyday life or with politics or with the statecraft or with the kings and the council of ministers, but it has more to do with the religious pursuits of people. It's about gods, it's about ways to propitiate God, and it is about high philosophy if we talk of Upanishads and so forth. So Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is a very important source material, literary source material for the reconstruction of Mauryan period, is certainly of a different kind, and it is first of its kind in Indian history. And therefore, our information and understanding about the Mauryan period, or from the periods from the period from where the Mauryan rule started, undergoes some kind of a qualitative change. So, there is more clarity with which we understand things about the Mauryan times and even in the subsequent period, primarily because we have very good and reliable sources of historical reconstruction, be it literary or even archaeological, we shall see. And what happens actually when we have a wide pool of historical sources is that historians can corroborate whatever they are trying to figure out, or whatever they are trying to weave as some kind of a narrative. They can cross verify the details contained in a literary source with the archaeological counterpart, just to see its viability, just to see how correct or how true these descriptions could have been. So, the margin of error that any literary source, being a directly mental product, so to say, because it is the creation of mind. So, there is bound to be an element of human bias in whatever we write. So, Kautilya's Arthashastra certainly would carry the bias element of the author, but given the fact that there also are other sources, literary sources, given the fact that there also are very identifiable archaeological remains coming from different Mauryan sites, that means that whatever exaggeration or whatever slant that a particular literary source might carry can be corrected, can be rectified, can be brought to realistic proportions in reconstructing the history of that particular period. So, that is something that Mauryan period does have. So, historians have the luxury of corroborating the information contained in one source by the details given in other kinds of sources or similar kinds of sources originating from different source or from different tradition. For instance, if we say that Kautilya, being a Brahmin, would inform about the state of affairs in a particular way, with a particular slant, with a particular bias, then even within literary sources we also have Jatak stories. We also have Deepavansh, we also have Mahavansh, the Buddhist chronicles coming from Sri Lanka, and they contain some bit of details which can be used to check and cross check whatever is contained in some other source, say which is a typically Brahmanical source, and that kind of gives us a true sense of proportion about the subject matter that we are dealing with. So, this is something that we have in the case of Mauryans, which we did not have in the case of previous period. Now, having said or having discussed the source part of the difference with respect to the sources that we have with respect to the preceding period, let us now get into the details of the kinds of sources that we have for the reconstruction from Mauryan period. To begin with, if we talk of literary period, literary sources, then as is discussed, the iconic Kautilya's Arthashastra comes very handy. This was, people did not know about Kautilya's Arthashastra and its time pertinence. It is only around the first couple of decades of 19th century that we started understanding, we started decoding it with respect to the time that it belongs to. And this period was ascribed to the Kautilya's Arthashastra, although Kautilya's Arthashastra avoids names and places names in a very pointed way, and it does not also by itself tell us about the actual time to which it belonged to or when it was written. Nevertheless, the description does match the Mauryan information that we have from other sources also. So there is a little bit of debate around the timing, around the time bracket to which Kautilya's Arthashastra can be put into. Nevertheless, by and large, the agreement is that it is about the description of times which actually were Mauryan times. All of us know that Vishnugupta or Kautilya or Chanakya, they are all the same names, belonged to this period, and he was the one who mentored Chandragupta Maurya, and he was the one who was very instrumental in defeating the Nandas who were erstwhile ruling over the Magad area, and Magad area would presently correspond with what present day we understand as Bihar, the central part of Bihar along the river Ganga, which technically is the middle Gangetic plain. So the area from Allahabad to say Bhagalpur, which is the eastern terminal point of Bihar, thereafter we have West Bengal. So this by and large it is this area that we are talking of. Of course, the eastern edge of Magad was Ang Desh, which is present day Bhagalpur, but we know that by around the end of 6th century BC, Ang area was also included in Magad, and that's how the Magadhan supremacy was established around the end of 6th century BC. We know of the story of Bimbisar, Ajatashatru and so forth, and subsequent to that we have the rule of the Nandas, and it is the Mahapadma Nand who probably was the last Nanda ruler, and it is in the context of Alexander's invasion in the 320s that we find that there is a fair degree of confusion and political uncertainty in even the eastern part of the Indus River, although it is said that Alexander did not venture into the eastern part of Indus and did not come to the Gangetic belt and so forth, and after his retreat it was Seleucus Nicator who was the envoy, who was the satrap, who was given the charge of ruling over this area, and Chandragupta Maurya is supposed to have defeated not only the Nanda rulers to establish the supremacy over Magad area, but he is credited to have even defeated Seleucus, because the treaty, the peace treaty which was struck records that Seleucus gave away his daughter to marry Chandragupta Maurya, and Chandragupta gave a good number of elephants and several other gifts in return. So it was a kind of a peace treaty, but in ancient context, giving away one's daughter to another king in military context meant, although it is a matrimonial context that we are talking of, but the military undertone of this is the conquest by or upper hand of Chandragupta in the military confrontation that might have happened. So this is how the Mauryas established their rule, and all these details of course are not coming from only Kautilya's Arthashastra. We shall see as to what is the nature of Kautilya's Arthashastra, and as we said, it differs from several other texts. Basically, these details or several other anecdotes associated with it also partially come from some subsequent plays which were written, say, in the Gupta period. So around 400 AD or in the period around it. So that would mean that it is separated from the Mauryan period by a good 500 years or so, 500-600 years, and nevertheless, whatever was part of public memory or public fascination about the Mauryan times got recorded in plays like Mudra Rakshas, which was penned down in the Gupta period, and that tells us about the details around the Mauryan kings and several other episodes associated with it. So, of course, it is not a proper historical kind of documented thing. It is a play. So, there would be fair degree of imagination, romance, and several other literary trappings. Nevertheless, it does give us the flavor of the time. The ideals, the aspirations certainly are captured in these plays, and that's how reconstructing the narrative of the Mauryan period becomes somewhat more tenable on account of the presence of these sources. Also important, apart from Kautilya's Arthashastra, whose nature we shall discuss very shortly, we have accounts coming from foreigners, so to say. We know of Megasthenes, who was Seleucus's envoy, Greek envoy, in the Chandragupta Maurya's court at Patliputra, which was the capital city of the Mauryas, the present day Patna. And Megasthenes has penned down vivid details about the city administration in particular. Of course, Megasthenes' account do carry several inconsistencies and inaccuracies, but in association with other details, say Ashokan inscriptions or whatever is described in Kautilya's Arthashastra, they do fit in somewhat cogently, and that gives more confidence to the historians to establish what is more tenable account of the Mauryan period. For instance, while talking of the Patliputra, the capital city of the Mauryas, Megasthenes informs us in his book Indica that Patliputra had around 64 gates and it had around 570 towers. It also tells us that it was a city which was surrounded by wooden wall, and some of the remains found from Kumrar, which is at present day Patna, which probably housed the royal palace. So, we have some burnt remains of those wooden pillars and some stone artifacts also around that area, and that means that the description by Megasthenes is not very far. It could be some bit of exaggeration on account of fascination, but it is not very much ahistorical either. So, that is yet another element that we need to understand. Also important is the fact that Megasthenes, particularly coming from a perspective which is non-Indian. So, he is adopting a perspective which could be influenced by what he saw in Greece or what he saw in Persia, and now he is seeing it in the case of Patliputra, and is implicitly trying to compare and contrast the cities that he had seen or had heard of in his lifetime. And with this perspective, he does inform us that the splendor and glory of Patliputra as a city rivaled several Persian iconic cities like say Susa and Ecbatana and so forth, which were contemporary cities and magnificent cities. So, he does give us a sense of proportion in which the Mauryan times or the Mauryan city or the capital had to be understood. Now, this is about Megasthenes' account. Also, we may add here that in the present circumstances or in the present situation, historians don't have access to Megasthenes' Indica, because whatever was contained in Megasthenes' Indica, that is not kept intact as one book, and what comes to the historians is some references of Megasthenes' Indica by references contained in some other Greek writers. And so Indica as one book does not exist now, but portions of Megasthenes' Indica are referred to by several other authors, Greek authors, separated in terms of time of Megasthenes by, say, couple of centuries, but they do credit Megasthenes being the source, and that's how we know about Megasthenes' Indica. So there is a little bit of a problem here. Nevertheless, that is something which accords fair degree of credibility to the narrative that is weaved around the Mauryan period. So that is the we can say advantage and limitation of the source called Megasthenes' Indica, which is a foreigner's account. At the same time, when we talk of Kautilya's Arthashastra, we have already discussed that Kautilya, being a Brahmin, is likely to color his interpretation on account of his own biases and worldview. But alongside it, historians also discuss the extent to which the information contained in Kautilya's Arthashastra can be regarded as descriptive. And it's here that since the account does not contain the actual timeline, it also avoids naming particular kings, etc. Therefore, historians say that it appears to be more of a prescriptive kind of a text than a descriptive one. So, a good source material for his historical reconstruction could have been one which was descriptive, but it seems that it is more of a kind of theory building around this period, that the information is revealed to us through Kautilya's Arthashastra. Nevertheless, flavor of the time, tinge of the time, and the overall trajectory of the politics around this period is very much contained in a rather detailed way in Kautilya's Arthashastra. It also even tells us about the rate of taxation. So, although and there is something to be had, it is not entirely seeped into the traditional mold of writing, because traditionally a king should levy, in Indian case, 1/6 as the tax. So, Shadbhag is what is prescribed by tradition to be levied as a revenue, as a royal tax. But Kautilya's Arthashastra does tell us that it is rather 1/4 of the produce that was taxed, and therefore the might of the state, the capacity of the state, the responsibility of the state is redefined in Kautilya's Arthashastra, and this redefined role of the state is something which becomes very clear when we read Ashoka's inscriptions. And even in the Mauryan times, the kind of works which are done by the, or which are expected of the ruler, appears to be qualitatively more expanded as compared to the conventional rulers and the expectations from them. For instance, in the Chandragupta Maurya's period itself, we have one copper charter which copper plate, which is a Mahasthan copper plate, which tells us about the drought relief measures taken by the Mauryan rule. Even in subsequent period, in the Girnar inscription of Rudradaman, we have reference to some Gupta governor, some Mauryan governor who had caused a lake, Sudarshan Lake, to be made, and had also repaired this lake, and Rudradaman is claiming credit for having repaired it subsequently, but he does owe it to Mauryan governor who probably got it made. So there are quite a few welfare measures which are spoken of not only in Kautilya's Arthashastra but even from other sources. And that tells us that Mauryan period is somewhat a transformed period in the sense of the duties expected from the king, and no wonder the national emblem that we have today, the Sarnath 4 lion capital emblem, the insignia that we carry as the national emblem, is picked up from the Mauryan period, because it is belonging to a period which is very enlightened and which is very welfareist so far as the state society itself is concerned. And we all know of what Ashoka envisioned with respect to peace, with respect to living together, so far as religious plurality, etc. are concerned, and therefore, and also important is the sheer timing of the information about all these things, since it is, as I said, Kautilya's Arthashastra getting discovered around this time, around the beginning of the 19th century, and it is only around this time that we are getting to know more and more about Ashok and Mauryan period, and several other archaeological excavations bringing to light several other information and facet about Mauryan period. And this is also the time when Indian national struggle for independence was going on, and we all know the spirit in which Indian national struggle was fought, the communal challenge and so forth. And it is in this context that these new information are coming up. The British response, the British challenge and the Indian intelligentsia's response to that challenge with respect to Indian ability to erect its own state and empire and bring the entire area under one rule and so forth. So Mauryan case did offer a very good example to buttress what the freedom fighters had been trying to argue on the intellectual plane, that is the ability of the Indians to govern themselves, such a huge continental area being under one political rule, which the British claimed that only they and they could do it, and no one else in Indian past had done it. So it was a good kind of example, a timely example that could be given to the British in response to what they themselves were trying to argue as a kind of ideological justification for their rule and so forth. So what we see is that the timing of the discoveries related to Mauryan period and the character of the Mauryan rule came very handy in identifying nationhood with the Mauryan times, and that's the context in which I've been saying that the Sarnath pillar lion capital went on to become the national emblem for us. So that is beside the point. In terms of sources, what we had been discussing is Kautilya's Arthashastra. We have understood that it appears to be more prescriptive than descriptive. Nevertheless, its contents are very rich and very fruitful. and it is ascribed to around this period. We also discussed about the foreign account in the case of Megasthenes Indica. Then we also spoke of several other say Buddhist and Jain texts. It could be oral, it could be part of their own tradition in which they chronicled facts. And for instance, the information contained in Ashoka's inscription does not mention Ashok or the writers or the person who got it engraved. The name is not directly mentioned. All it mentions is Piyadasi, Raja Piyadasi, and it does not mention Ashok. But how do we correlate? And this discovery was made. The inscriptions were already deciphered by James Prinsep in the 18th century itself. In the 19th century itself. And it was around the beginning of the 20th century, as we said, that Kautilya's Arthashastra was discovered. And but the correlation between Ashok and Piyadasi Raja could be made on account of the details contained in Sri Lankan Buddhist sources, the Deepavans, Mahavans and so forth. So this is how corroboration led to illumination of several other details related to the Mauryan period. Just a note, I do believe that at some instances I have mentioned the discovery of Kautilya's Arthashastra around the beginning of 19th century. That's a mistake. It's the beginning of 20th century. So that's a clarification that I'm offering. Now, having discussed this, let's come to a completely different source of historical reconstruction, which also appears for the first time in Indian history, and that is the inscriptional source. We all know of the iconic Ashokan inscriptions, be it edicts, cave inscriptions or pillar edicts. So Ashoka's Dhamma is described as part of the same inscriptions that Ashoka got engraved and erected at different places all across the subcontinental dimension of his empire. Even the extent of the subcontinental dimension of his empire is revealed through the geographical location of the Ashokan inscriptions. So we have quite a few from Uttarakhand, Bihar, even present day Pakistan, Gandhar area. We have some inscriptions in Gujarat, we have some inscriptions in Andhra Pradesh area, we have some inscriptions in Odisha, we have some Ashokan inscriptions in Karnataka. So all across the empire we have distribution of Ashokan edicts, which is a very solid kind of proof that this entire area was under the command of the Mauryans under Ashok. Also, in several of the inscriptions, he tells us about the neighboring estates. For instance, in one inscription, he talks of the neighboring estates in the northwestern area, and from where probably they had some kind of a diplomatic contact, or where he was also trying to spread Buddhism in these areas. And he clearly mentions that these areas are outside his empire. For instance, he talks of Syria, Egypt, Macedonia, Cyrene, Epirus, and we all know that he is talking of the Middle East areas of today. And certainly beyond Afghanistan, these areas were certainly not part of Ashokan empire. Similarly, in down south, the Cholas, Cheras, Pandyas, Satyaputras, these tribal chieftainships certainly were not part of Ashokan empire, and one of his edicts mentions it very clearly. Also, we know of Atavikas, which would correspond with the present day, say, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand area, which was very dense in terms of forest and so forth, and forest dwellers probably lived here, and they were not kind of socialized with the state society and so forth. And in one of his inscriptions, he warns them of dire consequences if they don't mend their ways. So this is despite the ahimsa overtone of Ashok that he is talking about, and that tells us that probably these areas were also not conquered, or maybe that state did not intend to conquer these areas on account of socio-economic or even political reasons. So reconstruction of the empire itself, boundary of the empire, and several other qualitative aspects of administration and the historical trajectory of change, the agency through which changes were brought about, the pressure that the state society suffered on account of several duties that it had taken upon itself, the welfareist weight that lay on the monarchs. All these things created a kind of constant pressure to create more and more resources, to create more and more avenues for furthering resources for the state. And it seems, if you do even a cursory reading of Kautilya's Arthashastra, it seems that the state is under tremendous pressure to look for more and more additional sources of revenue generation. And we shall be talking about it in qualitative terms, as we said towards the beginning of our lecture, that these aspects of administration or these compulsions which went on to define the nature of the empire itself and its assessment, whether it was centralized or decentralized, the way we need to understand it, all these things we shall be taking up for discussion in the next part of our lecture, which would soon follow.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us once again a very productive session. And dear friends, if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback regarding this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. And if you want to view this particular lecture, then for this, you can see this lecture on YouTube, which we would be going to upload soon for you, so that it becomes convenient for you to see this lecture ample of times, the number of times. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Shankar Kumar for giving his precious time as well as his precious inputs to this very lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.